Well, this is Dr. Jeff Meldrum with the 25th Hour Radio Show with Rob and Randy.
The 25th Hour Radio Show.
First of all, Dr. Meldrum, what drew you towards the field of study that you are in currently?
Well, I'm a physical anthropologist by training. I was always fascinated with the notion of prehistoric man and our evolutionary history, and as well as our similarity to the primates, and I sort of found my niche in the arena of locomotor anatomy, the adaptations for the primates used to move about through their environment, and was particularly fascinated with the specializations of the human anatomy for walking on two legs, or bipedalism. And so here I am after many, many years of school and a dissertation and some lots of teaching experience under my belt now, and research experience.
At what point were you first introduced to the idea of a Bigfoot being a living creature,
Right.
especially in this day and age, and what was your first public connection with that idea?
Well, I was always fascinated with the whole notion of mysterious primates like the Yeti and Bigfoot. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, so I was familiar with the stories and the accounts. In fact, when I was in grade school, our librarian, Mary Bessiker, was John Green's niece. I lived in Spokane, Washington at the time. I was exposed through her. Actually did a class project on Bigfoot when we were doing a unit on primates. I was in Spokane when Roger Patterson came through with the documentary film he had produced, showcasing the film clip, the 60-second film clip, and was fascinated at that age because, as I said, I was already fascinated with all things prehistoric and mysterious. So the notion that there might be some quote-unquote missing link or some relic population out there that was very similar to us in its appearance, insofar as it walked on two legs, it was upright like we are. That was quite intriguing, and my interest at that point was similar to any enthusiast who watched for the documentary specials, which obviously weren't as prolific as they are today, but rifling through old newspaper archives and back issues of magazines, finding references and flipping articles and putting together scrapbooks of references. And those youthful enthusiasms waxed and waned through the years. I was always intrigued by it, but it seemed to sort of drag on. It seemed to be anything but coming closer to resolution. And so I went off, and other interests caught my attention, and it wasn't until back in 1996, well, actually 1995, when I crossed paths first with Richard Greenwell. And it was actually the Redwoods video that initially sort of set the ball in motion. He had asked me, as a primatologist, anthropologist, to take a look at this video clip that was brought to his attention, and in the course of the filming of a documentary, I was able to go to the site and do the forensics and investigate it, talk to the eyewitnesses, record their interviews, and it was quite perplexing and intriguing. I thought maybe I should catch up on what I'd missed, what had transpired in my absence from the subject matter, and that included a visit up to see Grover Krantz and find out what he thought about all this in person, and take a look at his footprint casts. The return home back to Boise, where I was visiting family, involved a detour to visit Paul Freeman, Wes Summerlin, Bill Lowry, that gang in Walla Walla. And that precipitated Paul taking me up into the foothills and just on a spontaneous coincidence, it seemed, show me a long line of footprints that were really, really amazing. And given my position, what I knew about the human, the anatomy of the human foot, its comparisons to non-human primates, and the hominid fossil record of footprints, I was really, really quite impressed, and picked up on details that probably many would miss, and that tipped the scales, in the direction of credibility, or at least piqued my interest to the point that I thought, I need to pursue this. So here I am, some 15, 12, 16 years later.
You've definitely made some allies in your scientific quest for Sasquatch. Is there any colleagues of yours that don't share your enthusiasm for Sasquatch?
Oh, of course. I mean, the reaction from my colleagues really spans the gambit from sincere interest and curiosity and support of what I'm doing to, I can only describe as a visceral reaction, visceral rejection of what I'm about. And that goes with any cross-section of humanity, I guess, even although you might hold the scientific community to a higher standard of objectivity and open-mindedness, but it's not really. It's just as human as any other subset of the population. And so, there's been a lot. It's not as I'm pretty. I'm a guy who's, I think, pretty easy to get along with, as long as you're honest and you're rational in your dealings with me, and so I don't think I've made enemies. If anything, I think I've tended to make friends and allies and maybe open some minds, but it's impossible to please everybody, obviously.
Right. Well, now you started to talk about Walla Walla. Can we talk about the prints that you come across there?
Certainly. That still stands out as quite a singular and significant event. It certainly was a pivotal point for me. The first opportunity to actually witness footprints in the ground, and it was not just an isolated track in a mud puddle, but it was a long line of footprints, some 35, 45. And didn't actually. I was so taken aback by the whole incident that I honestly did not do as thorough a case to document it as I would now, and forgot things that came to me in with 20/20 hindsight. But I mean, for example, being so flabbergasted by it that I completely forgot that I had a video camera in its case behind the seat of the pickup truck. I shot lots of pictures, lots of still shots, but it would have been nice to have videotaped that entire line with the tracks in sequence and all, because it's not that often that we have that opportunity to see a long line of successive footprints. In any case, they were quite amazing. I mean, I'd gotten an earful from several people. One of the few people who I was able to annoy, I guess, faster than anyone else can claim credit to, but that was Rene Hinden. And Rene had given me an earful about Paul Freeman, forewarning me about Paul Freeman, in the Hinden's estimation, his proclivity for hoaxing things. I think that was very overstated, but I was very skeptical going into it. And so seeing these remarkably clear tracks in this fine silt was just really set me back on my heels. And I'm looking at details like skin ridge patterns, and that were still persistent even though the drizzly rainy weather was quickly obliterating those kinds of details, and some of the tracks were already filled in with rainwater. But tension cracks and pressure ridges and drag-ins and drag-outs and half-tracks, I mean, the animation was so evident.
That's something that's very hard to hoax, is what you're saying.
Well, yeah. I mean, it certainly was not a matter of somebody strapping on a pair of rigid artificial feet and trotting off a line of tracks. I mean, the half tracks alone would have precluded that possibility. But there was clear detail of toe variation, toe position variation. In some instances, the toes were quite extended. In others, they were tightly flexed, and it dug in to gain purchase in the soil. In some cases, they made these. They slid and made these grooves with extrusions up between the toes, and then finally the pad dug in and got a purchase in the wet soil. I mean, there were just so many details. At the time, I was just kind of pinching myself because it was starting to sink in that this could only be the real thing, and there really was something to this whole. I was always I was fascinated with it. I was always kind of non-committal. I was especially coming at it from the position that I was now as a professional academic, and recognizing, being fully aware of the ridicule that Dr. Grover Krantz had the brunt of in his career. I mean, there was actually a moment when I sat there and thought to myself, do I really want to go down this path or not? But boy, how could you walk away from something like this? It was just amazing.
How long has the evidence of Bigfoot been recorded throughout history?
Well, if you cast the net widely and you talk about relic hominoids, as a theme I've tried to perpetuate now or to promote in order to place the Sasquatch within a much broader context. There are traditions of wild men all around the world from the earliest written records that we have. The Gilgamesh epic, is often pointed to. The sidekick Enkidu was, by all descriptions and all points of behavior and metaphorical references, was a wild man who was out in the wilderness, who never knew civilization, and yet was very human-like in many of its aspects, but covered with hair, which was described as flowing like wheat in the wind when it ran, with the wild beasts. But so you have those things. You have in many cultures where there's appropriate habitat, that being forested and mountainous terrain that isn't so densely occupied by humans. There are stories of similar kinds of creatures, and not all of them, in my opinion, equivalent to Sasquatch. Some of them show much, much more human-like characteristics, like the Almasti in Russia. And while the North American Sasquatch, its giant stature and its unhuman proportions are much more similar to something like the Chinese Yeren, for example. And then you have things like the Orang Pendek, which could well be a manifestation of what science calls the Homo floresiensis, this little small diminutive, 3.5 foot tall, hair-covered hominid or hominoid that is said to frequent the forests of Southeast Asia and the islands of Indonesia and so on. So it's pervasive. That's what's really quite interesting, I think, is that this doesn't just kind of fall out of the ether into our laps with no context, no basis. In reality, it has an ecological, biogeographical, paleontological precedent, and we would really, if we're honest, we would have to ask, why wouldn't we expect to find other species of ape and hominid living alongside of us? That's been the rule rather than the exception throughout the history of the human genus.
I got a question, and it's probably going to sound silly, but we talked about bipedal and quadrupedal. Has anyone ever looked for knuckle prints or anything like that?
Well, there have been some documented. Paul Freeman did cast a very amazing pair of, or set of knuckle prints, which also includes the pad and side profile of the thumb with its nail. And the anatomical detail is really quite extraordinary. I mean, you can run your finger across the knuckle and feel that sort of bicondylar or barbell-shaped end of the joint on those bones within the digits. And there's another print that Freeman had cast that actually he never correctly identified. And when he showed it to me, when I acquired his collection, he just had labeled it as toes, like it was a scuff mark left by toes. But as I was looking at it, suddenly, the penny dropped, and I realized what it was. It was a fist, the outside edge of a fist, pressed into the ground, and you could see the heel of the palm and the outside profile of the fifth digit and the knuckles of the other four, or actually of the three digits, so that the four fingers left knuckle prints as the fist was used to push up, presumably, I would think, getting up or balancing.
So looking at the knuckle prints, and then comparatively looking at how the foot looks, I mean, the foot doesn't appear to be one of a tree climber. So,
right.
So, I mean, do you think that Bigfoot or Sasquatch, do you feel like possibly they've lost their ability to climb due to evolution, or?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you start pushing, 700, 800, 900 pounds, you have no business climbing in a tree, because if you fall, you're going to break something that could cost you your life. Ultimately, incapacitate you to the point that it'll be a fatal injury. And so, it's just like with large gorillas. The males tend to stay on the ground, and they show much less divergence of the big toe, if that's what you're working towards. So the Sasquatch footprint only resembles a human footprint in the most superficial of ways. That is, it's reduced the length of its toes, and it's lost the divergence of the big toe. But if you compare a mountain gorilla foot with a chimpanzee foot, the same trajectory is present. It's just not extended along that trajectory as far as the Sasquatch footprint did. But it has much greater breadth to length ratio. Its toes are longer relative to the foot length than humans are. Its heel is much longer, which accords with the biomechanics of having a flexible midfoot with the mid-tarsal break, as I've described. And that feature itself is also a more primitive characteristic. It lacks a longitudinal arch that leaves a consistent signature in the footprints from step to step as it does in the human footprint. So, it's only the most superficial facsimile of an enlarged human footprint, and that's, again, for me, that's what's really quite convincing, that we're dealing with something that's real. Because if someone were going to hoax something like this, either it would be completely, if it diverged from the human pattern and they were hoaxing, there would be all sorts of inconsistencies. And we do see some which point to some footprints as being less credible or more likely fabricated or embellished or altered. But if someone were going to hoax and try to make it consistent, they might use the human foot as a pattern and then just enlarge it and stretch it out.
Looking at all the visualizations that people have put up over the years of what they think Bigfoot looks like. Me personally, I've always imagined it being like a cross between an early hominid and maybe Gigantopithecus. Not quite Gigantopithecus itself, but maybe a morphed version of that. More
well, and people's perceptions of Gigantopithecus are quite skewed, because you have to realize that any depiction of Gigantopithecus, any reconstruction, is highly speculative, because we have simply jaws and teeth. Now, Grover's skull, the reconstruction of the skull done by Grover, is a speculative one, but it is a sound reconstruction, but it is based on the assumption that indeed Gigantopithecus had a basically primate, a great ape-shaped skull with a cranium that was held a brain that was proportionate to its body size in terms of that of a gorilla or chimpanzee, other great apes. Mm-hmm. And he based that in part on examination of the Patterson-Gimlin film, which shows a very pongid-like cranium. I mean, it's the brain of that creature is a tinny bigger than a gorilla of that size. I mean, in fact, Patty looks remarkably like a gorilla with long legs and a foot with a non-divergent toe. I mean,
as an anthropologist, I mean, you've seen the Patterson-Gimlin film, obviously.
Oh yeah.
What's your take on it after watching?
Oh, I'm absolutely confident that it's authentic. In fact, Bill Munns and I, on a grant that I was able to acquire from a private foundation, are doing what I believe will be the end-all analysis. That stands on the shoulders of those who have gone before, but it has Bill has now archived multiple copies of the film with high-resolution scans, and so he can look at a feature on one frame and wonder whether that's an artifact of the film or that's actually a feature on the subject, on the creature. And all he has to do now is call up alternate frames of different copies where maybe a smudge or a blur or an artifact disappears in the next comparison because it wasn't there. It was an artifact of the copying process or some damage to the film or just in I said that artifact of the copying process. So plus Bill has done some really great experiments. He is an accomplished photogrammetrist, so he's done all kinds of 3D reconstruction from the imagery on the film itself, which has been site verified at the film site itself, with the assistance of some great people who've done a lot of work. I mean, this has been a very broad collaborative effort. And once that is entirely nailed down, and we hope to revisit the site one last time, maybe even do an aerial survey of it in the wintertime because there's so much growth. The alders that have filled in that creek bottom would make it rather difficult to do some of the final verifications you'd like to do. So we've been talking about maybe going down and doing the flyover in the wintertime. But in any case, once that's nailed down, he can establish once and for all what the focal length of the lens was, and then it's a simple proportionality to determine what the height of the film subject was, and that itself will be a very significant resolution to an ongoing controversy about the height of the subject. But as far as and where I kind of come in the most is in the comparative anatomy, and so we've been doing things to look at the anatomy that's visible on the film subject, and there are so many remarkable details that are very evident in the better quality copies, which most people don't appreciate because they see a license, the VHS copy that Mrs. Patterson makes available to the television documentary circuits, and it's just not nearly as good a quality as the imagery that Bill is working off of and that we have to examine. It's really remarkable.
Well, I'm really anxious to see those results.
Yeah. So we'll be putting together a number of manuscripts. There'll be some of it actually that may be featured in a documentary that has producer has shown interest in doing a fuller, more thorough depiction rather of the analysis, and some of it will be published in the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, and I think Bill aims to also do some in some of the costume literature, some of the publications in the costume industry, and so I think it'll be great. It'll turn attention back to that very important piece of footage, and then you have to, then you're left with how do you account for it? If there isn't such a thing as the Sasquatch, how do you account for this remarkable figure on this piece of film footage.
Who do people contact if they get an audio or video recording of a possible Bigfoot? You know, I'm always suspect when a video is released straight to YouTube. You know.
Oh yeah. Well,
what do you suggest?
Yeah, I know. Well, when it comes to video, I'm happy to take a first look at it and evaluate it. I'm certainly not in a position to do any type of quantitative analysis of audio recordings, although I certainly can pick out sounds that I'm familiar with. I mean, I was contacted one time by a producer who was all hot about a particular audio recording, and I took one listen to it, and I said, "It's a bobcat." I mean, it was very feline. I said, "It's not as can't be a cougar, and the only other thing out there likely is a bobcat." And so, a quick Google search brought up several audio files. One was almost identical. I mean, not that it was, I think the person did spontaneously record a bobcat call in the wild, but it was clearly identifiable as that. And this is one of the things that that I'm really going to start pushing hard, and I hope not to offend or to ruffle people's feathers, but I have as my involvement has progressed, I've really bent over backwards to be very accommodating and give everybody a shot at airing their piece of footage and share with me their explanation. And quite honestly, I just cannot afford the time. There have been so many things sent and so many requests to look at this picture or listen to this or that. I'm most eager to first examine, first and foremost, what I'm best at, and that is to evaluate the footprint evidence and try to, and I certainly, I want to continue to archive and catalog more and more good, solid examples of footprints that indicate that the Sasquatch is out there. But I'm really going to start admonishing people to step up to the plate and educate themselves. If they're going to be enthusiasts that want to be involved, or let me back up. If they want to be investigators who want to be involved and who want to see data accumulate that will shed light on the distribution and habits of these creatures, then they need to educate themselves in the skills necessary to first to document and to collect the appropriate kinds of data and to give it an initial screening. A lot of times people send me things just to get my opinion, and not having been very convinced themselves of the circumstances or the possibility that what they may have found, the pothole or the mud puddle is actually a footprint or not, for example. And I really think that, because I've rubbed shoulders with so many people. I always hate to use the word amateur whenever I'm talking to the press or talking in an interview, because there's so many people that are not professional scientists, but whose experience and training and education, familiarity with the natural history of various species and the flora out there are so skilled and knowledgeable that the term amateur just doesn't really apply. They're just not professionals in the sense of not getting paid. It's not their day job, in other words. But let me take just a moment and kind of cast this in a slightly different light. I was sitting in a conference not too long ago, and a colleague of mine was making a presentation, and he was a naturalist, an entomologist in particular, and was studying the incursion of Africanized bees into the United States. Well, that's a big job for one person, or even a few professional scientists. And so, much like the extensive bird counts that are done, where the professional birders or academic ornithologists rely heavily on the observations of avocational birders, this scientist put up a call for assistance from individuals who he labeled as citizen scientists, and he created a web page, and he posted instructional files on how to identify these Africanized bees, what were the key characteristics, how to collect them, how to capture them, how to collect them and preserve them, and send him the samples with the information about where they were collected and when. And then he would log all that data. And so you could also, on their webpage, bring up a map, and you could see where these well-documented and verified examples of reports were located. Now, and it just hit me, that's what we need. We're close to that, but that's what we need in the Bigfoot community. We need people who are citizen scientists, who aren't just enthusiasts, who don't report every bump in the night, every bent stick, every overturned rock as sign of Sasquatch activity, but who are discriminating, who educate themselves on how to document the evidence, who can tell the difference between a bear print and a Sasquatch print, who can tell the difference between an elk print and a Sasquatch print.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's when it gets really discouraging, when backwards pointed overlapping elk tracks get identified as Sasquatch prints. And it's fine to ask questions, but then, and most people who I do talk to are very good about when I try to inform and point out where there is a misidentification, and not all are, but an overwhelming number are. And I think then as these solid data, I was asked by one producer who was looking for a graphic. He wanted an image of the distribution, the frequency and distribution of Sasquatch reports. Well, the one that came up in his Google search was the one that, let's see, is it the one with Google Earth, I think, where they plotted on. And my gosh, the entire eastern United States, from the Mississippi to the Atlantic seaboard, is one solid Bigfoot playground by the looks of that map, which is just, in my opinion, ridiculous. And so that kind of data that accumulates where there is no verification or little verification, something gets logged. If someone hears an unfamiliar sound in the night, they call it Bigfoot. If they find a broken twig with a scuff mark on the ground beside it, or every piece of hair, this is one of the. And there's another case in point.
You can almost think finding Bigfoot for that.
Well, I don't want to blame them for that. I mean,
but seriously,
Cliff,
that's
Yeah. Well, Cliff and I stay in touch quite a bit, and Cliff does a lot of very good stuff comes to Cliff's attention as a result of his exposure through finding Bigfoot. But you're right. I mean, there's a certain a certain responsibility that goes with the territory, I guess. Absolutely. But one of the points I was going to make there is that a disconcerting comment, and maybe she can clarify this for me, but Dr. Ketchum suggests that she's been the recipient of a large number of samples that have figured in her study in one way or another. Now, I don't know that if she's ever actually said that all of the samples that she's received have been consistent with her findings or not. That's the impression that many people have taken and have begun to repeat. And so I don't want to necessarily attribute that to her if that's inaccurate. Mm-hmm. But my experience has been, when I was screening some of the hair samples that people were sending to me with the desire that they be sent on to Brian Sykes, I told Dr. Sykes that I would screen these on the basis of the morphology as has been established from Dr. Fehrenbach's analyses, the criteria that he's kind of set as the gold standard. But the most fundamental one is the absence of underfur. That it's primate hair. The hair sample is not differentiated into under fur and coarser guard hairs, but there's a single type of hair, perhaps of varying length, but it has a consistent morphology.
Has Bigfoot's foot morphology changed since the initial findings of evidence?
The foot morphology? Oh, no, it hasn't.
It's been consistent.
So there were some. Let me finish this one thought, and then I'll come back to that. But my point is that of all the hair samples that came to me, I probably looked at over a dozen. I only forwarded 2 or 3, because all the rest were immediately eliminated. They were not primates. They had characteristics that, like long tapering tips of a coarse guard hair, or they had a combination of guard hair and underfur. They had a very, very thick, blocky medulla. I mean, there were characteristics that eliminated them immediately. So I have to wonder how it is that Melba was the recipient of so many authentic samples. And like I said, she can clarify that. I think it would be important to clarify that. As far as the footprints, no, there hasn't been any kind of evolution of over time, like UFOs evolving from cigar-shaped to disc-shaped to whatever shaped, spheres or whatever. You can go back to some of the earliest documented photos and casts. There is some regional kind of familial traits that pop up, like the split ball feature that was so emphasized in some of the early footprints. That was in part because of the exaggeration due to Bob Titmus's cleaning up of some of the casts, and then Ivan Sanderson, depicted some things that and exaggerated that split ball. But you only get a split ball when the individual or individuals have a sole pad that extends a little further up underneath the toes, and humans show that same characteristic too. We have slightly webbed toes. In other words, the sole pad extends further up than that joint at the metatarsal phalanges. So, and the individuals in Northern California showed that characteristic, which also made, because the sole pad extended further up under the toes, when the toes curled, they looked like peas in a pod, and with very short or non-apparent stems and this double ball feature. And then elsewhere, tracks were being found that had longer toes with less sole pad up under. I mean, the toes in reality were just as long in the ones in Northern California. And you can see that when you look at Patty's footprints, the film site footprints. When you look at the sole of her foot, she has stubby-looking toes with, pads that are kind of peas in a pod arrangement. But if you look at some of those frames where you can see her toes dorsiflex or extend upward during the swing of the step, they are quite long. In fact, it was really quite interesting. Based on the presence of that flexion crease, I did a reconstruction and showed where I felt the joint at the base of the toes was located, and had not noticed that particular frame, or 2 or 3 frames where you can see those toes dorsiflex. And when you look at it from the dorsal, it confirms my model of the foot skeletal proportions of the Patterson-Gimlin film site tracks. So that's another strong corroboration of those interpretations.
Dr. Meldrum, we're running a little bit short on time, but before we go,
sure.
Do you have any words of wisdom? Now, I know you touched on this earlier, but do you have any words of wisdom for all the Bigfoot researchers, investigators out there, with their game cameras, their audio recorders, video recorders, and also what would you recommend to people who are wanting to learn about Bigfoot, such as books, websites, etc.? All the newfound Bigfoot fans, who just now started watching Finding Bigfoot and stuff like that.
Sure. Well, I would, I guess, shamelessly first recommend my own book as a starting point to get a handle on what the baseline is of many of the different facets of the evidence. But I think it's important that people...
Now, you're talking about your own book, that's Legend Meets Science, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science. Mm-hmm. But I always encourage people to, if they're in an area that has a history of Sasquatch activity or reports, to rather than constantly looking for the grass being greener somewhere else, to just get familiar with their neighborhood, because that's where they're going to be able to spend the most time, and that's what's critical. And by getting familiar, what I mean is, get to know the lay of the land and where the cover is, where the resources are, where the berry patches are, where the morels, sprout, and so forth, and train yourself, get familiar with the wildlife, learn the sounds that are out there in nature, do some tracking, practice making footprint casts by finding sign of other creatures, and learning to document and record and measure and take good photographs of those footprints first. I'm always, when people go out, these weekend warriors go out and have these regular interactions with Sasquatch, but they've never seen a deer, they've never seen a raccoon, they've never seen a skunk. That is tipsy-turvy in my mind.
Absolutely.
The encounter with the Sasquatch is the rare event. And I challenge anybody out there who claims to have habituation experiences to show me the evidence, and not just tell me the stories, but show me the evidence. I mean, if these are, well, let's not go there. We don't have time to go there either.
Well, Dr. Meldrum, we really thank you for being on our program, and you're always welcome to come back. I hope you enjoyed your time with us today.
Sure, it was fun to have a chat. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much.
The 25th Hour Radio Show.